My soul dancing like fire. Every day gets a little bit brighter. My soul dancing like fire, like fire, like fire. I've been carrying a burden. I've been carrying a
Expose
burden.
an irrational belief. Keep a person rational for a day. Expose irrational thinking. Keep a person rational for a lifetime. Truly wise words from our guest for today's podcast. We have the amazing Dr. Bo Bennett joining us to talk about logical fallacies. I will take this moment to extend a warm welcome to all our audience and also to our special guest. Bo, we are absolutely thrilled to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
Right, so let me give our audience a quick introduction about who Bo is. He is the author of the amazing book Logically Fallacious. It gives a clear, concise, and critical insight into what logical fallacies are all about and to understand in excess of 300 logical fallacies so that you will be able to understand arguments in the most reasonable manner and present arguments without such deafening fallacies. His other books include The Concept, a critical and honest look at God and religion, Positive Humanism, and Year to Success, a fabulous and emphatic book on how to achieve success in this fast-paced world. Bo also has a podcast titled The Dr. Bo Show, which you can access at www.thedrboshow.com. The DRBO show.com. I'll be dropping the links to the show in the description, where he approaches issues of concerning education and entertainment um, through critical thinking, reasoning, and a science-based approach. Bo also holds a PhD in social psychology. He has a master's degree in general psychology and a bachelor's degree in marketing. And interestingly, from March of 2014 until February of 2016, Bo was the producer and the host of the Humanist Hour, the official broadcast of the American Humanist Association. A truly versatile individual we have here with us on the podcast. So, Bo, we are thrilled to have you on the podcast. And you have a very interesting background. Before we move into our topic, you have a very interesting background, especially with your entrepreneurial initiatives. Can you give us a quick shot of how that was since your graduation in marketing?
Sure. Yeah. When I was always interested in business from the time I was 10. I always got myself involved in a lot of business activities. Like I would make keychain rings, like keychain ring holders in my dad's basement, and I would go around the neighborhood and sell them. I would be part of all those stupid those programs where the card people will pay little kids like not in money, but they pay them in prizes that are really cheap to go around and sell their products like to doors, like to their neighbors, door to door. So I would do that. I would always try to get involved in a lot of business. And when I went to school, I knew that I wanted to go to school for marketing, although I really loved psychology, but I knew that I wanted to make money. That was kind of my number one priority. I just wanted to be financially well off because living with my parents struggled quite a bit, and it was tough being in that environment. So I didn't want to be in that same position or put my children through that position. So after I went through school for marketing, I started a business. I did very well in that. I sold the business, and that gave me the opportunity to pretty much devote my life to whatever I wanted to at the time and really pursue psychology, which I loved, and just education and philosophy, learn more about religion, the sciences, pretty much everything. And I was fortunate enough, pretty much by age 29, to be able to really dive deep into that world and focus on that full time. And that's really what I've been doing for the last 20 something years.
And you have actually engaged in a lot of sales of the company that you build up to such huge reputations. What was the biggest uh, sale that you have achieved so far in your entrepreneurial career?
I sold my company Ad Graphics, which was one of the first web hosting businesses, back in 2001 for $20 million. And that was right after the internet bubble burst. for those who were around who remembered that, it was a crazy time when companies, anything internet based, was valued like through the roof. And then the economy straightened out and it realized that these companies were not worth that much. And I sold my company right on as soon as it kind of like downturned. So I did very well, but if I sold it a year earlier, maybe 2 years earlier, I could have done much better. But I'm not complaining.
So actually, our audience now get a good insight into what sort of a person we're dealing with. Like I said, he's very versatile with all the backgrounds. And Bo, when I read across your bio uh, in preparation to interact with you, I was fascinated to see that you had concentrated more on psychology, because when I saw your works on logical fallacies and questions of reasoning and critical thinking, I was expecting you to have um, a master's degree or a PhD or something of that sort in philosophy. So can you give our audience a quick introduction to how you focus so much on logical fallacies, so much as putting up a website, putting an online course, writing a book? What made you concentrate on logical fallacies, given that we don't normally come across such topics from anyone else other than philosophers?
Right. And that's really the interesting part about this whole thing is because logical fallacies, reasoning, critical thinking, it's interdisciplinary, meaning that it's not philosophy. It's a lot of different it's a lot of different topics all rolled up in one. And psychology is a major part of critical thinking, of logical fallacies, of reasoning. And I felt that after exploring what was out there in the world of reasoning and logical fallacies, I really felt that so much was missing because you had, as you suggest, these academic philosophers who were only getting half the story. So I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later, but logical fallacies, for the most part, they're really the foundation of fallacies. The basis is cognitive biases, things that our brain naturally works a certain way, the way that we reason and see things. And this is all psychology. And without fully understanding that, it's difficult to understand, like fully understand logical fallacies. I mean, you can memorize the definition, you can spot them in a like a standard syllogism or something. But if you want to fully understand them and you really want to avoid them and you want to spot them in others, psychology gives you an excellent background, and it is really an invaluable tool to help go down that road.
So now let's get into the core of the topic that we're discussing today. What does the term fallacy mean? I mean, it sure sounds fancy in a way, but what does fallacy actually entail?
Essentially, it's just an error in reasoning. And the distinction is it's an error in reasoning and not like something that's not true, not a falsehood, not a claimed fact that's actually not a fact. So it's an error in reasoning, and that's the big difference between just like a lie or an exaggeration or something that's not true versus a fallacy. And then, of course, when you think about the whole reasoning process, there are many different types of fallacies and categories of fallacies, different types of errors in reasoning and mistakes that could be made.
So given that fallacy actually aspects with the reasoning errors, how would you define, or what is the actual definition for logical fallacy, or what does it mean to say something is logically fallacious?
It means that, in essence, it's an error in reasoning. And of course, that's very generic and it's not clear. And that's why there are so many different fallacies. And some people will call a fallacy when something's really not quite a fallacy. It's sort of a fluid definition. And depending on who you ask, they might give you a different definition, what qualifies as a fallacy versus what doesn't qualify as a fallacy. So for that reason, I made sure that within my book and also on the website, I have different criteria for logical fallacies. So when we talk about logical fallacies, we're all pretty much on the same page. And according to my criteria, they must meet three key definitions or 3 points. One, it has to be an error in reasoning and not a factual error, which we already talked about. The second, it must be commonly applied to an argument, either in the form of the argument or the interpretation of the argument. So if you're just like being funny or being ironic, or if a comedian's on stage, they use analogies all the time, and they're, of course, they're false analogies, weak analogies, but that's why they're so funny. That wouldn't be fallacious, because there's no deception there. They're not applied to an argument. Somebody's not trying to, the comedian's not trying to make like a serious argument. It's just for entertainment purposes. And then also it must be deceptive in that it fools the average adult. So if it's very clear, then it's not really a fallacy. But if it's deceptive, whether it be purposely deceptive or just accidentally deceptive, then that really pushes it up that criteria for being a logical fallacy as well. So I could read the definition. What I have, if you take all of that, put it together, I define a logical fallacy as a concept with an argumentation that commonly leads to an error in reasoning due to the deceptive nature of its presentation.
Right. So before we move into the different types of logical fallacies and how we identify them, let me just quickly hold on to you the last time you said about deception, because most of the times certain things that we claim we know are logically fallacious, some of the most common ones that fall into these categories, which obviously you'll be referencing later on. As you said, it's an aspect of whether it is deceptive, whether that deception is clear. But aren't there cases when something is very plain to the eye, some sort of blatant logical reasoning error from side of the proponent? It is very blatant. So does that negate it from being a fallacy, even though it is even though the deception is not as concealed as it claims to be?
It depends on the circumstances, and that's why we have such an interactive forum, because the rules are not very clear, and depends on the context which something is used. So I couldn't just say a yes or no to that. It would depend on how it's actually being used and in what context.
Right. So Bo, now let's get into the crux of today's podcast, something that we want to educate our listeners on. There are, like you mentioned in your book, more than 300 logical fallacies out there. But what are some of the most common logical fallacies that, on average, someone can come across an argument, be it from a politician, be it from a philosopher, a debater, a news journalist, because everyone presents argument all the time. So, what are some of the most common logical fallacies? Can you list them out and go through them?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I could talk about just like a single logical fallacy for for 30 minutes. So I guess we'll just start with one. Probably, I don't know if any of these are rated in terms of how often they're used, but in my experience, the one that appears to be the most common in argumentation or in debate is called the straw man. And the straw man is basically when you mischaracterize, and it's usually on purpose, somebody's argument in order to make it easier to argue against and to defeat. And this is it's terrible too, because in rational discourse, especially in academia, when let's say a bunch of academics are debating a topic in a paper, like an academic paper that has been written, you want to make sure, it is your job to make sure you fully understand that argument the best you can, and understand their perspective, where they're coming from, what precisely they're saying, not what you think they're saying, but what they actually are saying and what they mean, and then address that argument. Now, in debates, there's a lot of entertainment value that we see on the internet, and even in politics on TV. That's kind of what people expect, and that's what they want. And you want to win a debate. I mean, it's kind of like a game, right. And that's why there's two different rule sets. Like, one, if you're actually trying to win a debate, you're trying to get people on your side, you're gonna fill that debate with fallacies. There are going to be so many fallacies in debates, and the straw man is one of them, because what you want is public opinion. You want the cheers. You want people clapping for you. You want to say those zingers and make everybody clap and boo the other person. And unfortunately, that's completely antithetical to scientific debate, to rational discourse, to academic debate. In cases where the goal of real good debate, academic debate, critical thinking debate, is to fully understand the position of the other person. So with the straw man, what we see is somebody will make an argument, and then somebody will reinterpret that argument, really something completely different than what the person said, mischaracterize it. It's a characterization of the argument, and then kind of make fun of the argument or really tear it down. Very easily tear it down too, because it's a bad argument. It would be a stupid argument. Nobody would ever make it, but that's kind of the goal. You're trying to, with a straw man, you sell the audience on the fact that they actually made that poor argument when they didn't. And so what you're doing, and here's another thing about logical fallacies, you could commit the logical fallacy. You could be the debater that purposely and deliberately mischaracterizes somebody's argument. Or you could be in the audience, not familiar with these techniques, not familiar with critical thinking and reasoning, and you will not be able to see that. You will think that they accurately are representing the other person's, the opponent's argument, when in fact they're not. So this goes right over your head. And unfortunately, this happens with most people. That's why, even if you're not actively in debate, if you're not debating people, if you're not engaged in these discussions, if you're just a spectator or somebody who reads these and you're not familiar with these kind of logical fallacies, everything will go over your head and you're not going to be well informed when you make your decisions.
Right. That was a brilliant insight, Bo. Now, when I look at logical fallacy, or when I engage in a discussion, an argument, if any of that sort, I come across some of the most common fallacies that most probably almost all persons, or all individuals who engage, be it an academic or be it a layman's argument, come in. So let me just list them out so our audience can easily relate to them as you explain them. So some of the ones that I come across most frequently is circular reasoning, appeal to emotion, appeal to popularity, and boy do I don't like ad hominem attacks. So can you quickly go through what these 4 fallacies are about?
Okay, sure. So remind me of the first one. We'll start with the first one that you had in your list.
Circular reasoning.
Circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is when you're essentially not adding any new information into the argument. So we hear that a lot, like to take a common religious argument that some people would make is that I believe the Bible was written by God because it says so in the Bible. And if you think about that, like it's people may believe that, and that's fine, but that's not a good reason. It's especially a terrible reason if you're trying to convince somebody who is not a believer that already believes that. So you're right. Working with information in this little circle, and you're not reaching outward to something else, pulling information in order to explain something a little bit better. So basically, the logical form is X is true because of Y, and Y is true because of X. And these are actually comical in a way. You could get if you listen to comedy a lot and listen to comedians, you'll hear or you'll read a lot of their jokes based on circular reason because it's so silly in a sense, because nobody would ever accept something like that. Another funny example is, I'm sure many of your listeners have received the email from the Prince of Nigeria saying that they've got tens of millions of dollars for them, right? And you're going to say, wait, well, why do you believe that? I mean, how could you believe something like that? And you say, well, it says so in the email. In the email, it says it's from the Prince of Nigeria, and that's why it is. And you say, well, no, you can't do that. It doesn't make sense. So that's a good example of circular reasoning. And in a sense, like in a deep philosophical sense, it's difficult to escape circularity because everybody has to start somewhere with some presuppositions, with some knowledge that's just true because it's true. And if we all have to do that, so a lot of times circular reasoning gets thrown out as like hey, you're committing the fallacy of circular reasoning, when in fact you're really not. You're just doing the best you can with what you have. Like, well, why do we even care about reasoning effectively? Well, because it works. uh, well, why does it work? Because it's effective reasoning. I mean, it's difficult. It works because it works. It works because it produces the results.
Yeah.
When you try to use reasoning to explain reasoning, you're caught in this circle, and you can't get out of it. But that's kind of the nature of things. You could only go so far back, and then you take it from there. So the circular reasoning fallacy really comes in when people, not out of necessity, but just not really out of critical thinking, justify their own reasonings for a silly reason by using the whole X is true because of Y and Y is true because of X. So let's go with the appeal to emotion. Now, appeal to emotion is a category of logical fallacies, because there are actually, if you think about all the different emotions there's appeal to anger, appeal to sadness, and you could take any human emotion and just put it an appeal to in front of it, and you have yourself a fallacy. That's why one of the criteria that I use is it has to be common. It has to be common enough, because there are so many different emotions, but these fallacies aren't really that common. But if you take emotion as one big category of fallacies, then that's extremely common. People are always appealing to emotions. And this is a really good one that I like to go over in great detail, like in the course I teach on logical fallacies online, because it's a good example of the difference between legitimate appeals to emotion versus fallacious appeals to emotion. So if you're trying to convince somebody of something, emotion is a fantastic tool to get them to do what you want them to do, or to get them to believe what you want them to believe. We're not completely logical creatures. We're both creatures of emotion and logic. And this goes even way back to Plato with his original idea of how to conduct a really good debate, how to convince people, how to persuade people of like policies back then, or ideas or whatever. And you have to use both logic, reason, and you have to use emotion. The difference is where it becomes fallacious, the appeal to emotion, is when you use emotion and you don't worry about the other part, the other very important half, and that's the rational part, the reason part. When you just play on people's emotions and there's no rational part behind it, there's nothing, or even worse, it's against reason, it's against rationality, and you're just focusing on emotion. This is very common with in the United States. We have what's called multi-level marketing. It's a way people sell things to each other, as opposed to going through a store. And a lot of times the product, people don't even know what the product is. It doesn't matter what they're selling. They're selling the dream, the American dream. Do you want to be rich? Do you want to have you want to have all the boats and the yachts, and then sell this product? They don't even care what the product is. It's not about that. What they're selling is they're selling the dream. They're just appealing to the emotion of the person instead of providing them the facts on the product or the service, what they're selling, which in most cases is garbage. But it doesn't matter, because that's not the technique. The technique is to appeal to their emotions, and that's completely fallacious. So once again, you need to be aware. Every good critical thinker needs to be aware when somebody is doing this to them, whether selling ideas or crappy products. It doesn't matter. If they're strictly appealing to the emotion and there's no reason or rational reason behind it, then it's fallacious.
Right. Yeah. So the next one is appeal to popularity.
A popularity, yeah. And that's just a common one that says, because a whole bunch of people believe it, therefore it must be true. A lot of times this is common, like in advertising. You have the different products that people will say, oh, well, everybody uses it, so it must be really good. Well, not necessarily. Everybody might use it because you're really good at marketing. You have an incredibly large budget. It doesn't mean the quality of the product is any better. So just because something's popular, it doesn't mean that it's true. And here again is something, there's some nuance to this idea, because there is something referred to as the wisdom of the crowds. And here in the States, we had this game, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? I don't know if it's still around. It might be. But there's a part in the game where the contestant,
We have the
the game,
Indian, we have the Indian variants of it here as well.
Okay. So the contestants are given questions, and if they don't know the question, if they don't know the answer, they could ask the audience.
The audience
And
poll.
right, do the audience poll. And generally speaking, statistically speaking, if the audience overwhelmingly votes a certain way, it's going to be right. And that's due to something called the wisdom of the crowds, because people have information. And if people are just guessing, let's say everybody guesses, and there's just 10% of the audience that actually knows the answer, then you'll have everybody that guesses, it'll be 50-50, but that 10% will push the answer over to like 60% or something, to a certain way. And now because of that, you have your correct answer. And that works because when there's knowledge readily available, something that's like a fact that can be confirmed, that people actually know for certain, then we could say that that's something that that could be susceptible to the wisdom of the crowds, and something that's that could be helpful. If a lot of people know it, then it's more likely to be true. But then there's a lot of caveats in there. Like, for example, if we go back to, let's say, sometime in history when everybody believed the world is flat. Now,
Mm-hmm.
clearly we know that's not the case today, or at least most of us do.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
obviously people online who don't believe that.
Some flat earthers.
Right. But back then, given how people experience the world and what they could experience and the information that they had access to, that's what they believed. It didn't mean that it was right. It just meant that it was the popular answer. It was most people believed. And most people didn't have access to the kind of, well, nobody had access to the kind of information that would verify that the earth was actually spherical. So because nobody had access to that information, it was just a belief. It was, so therefore it's an appeal to popularity to say, well, everybody believes the world is flat, therefore it is. So we see that a lot today, where people just point to the masses and say, well, everybody believes this. Or, do you know that 80% of Americans believe this, therefore it's true? No, 80% of Americans believe that, therefore 80% of Americans believe that. That's all we could say. We can't make that kind of conclusion, jump to the conclusion that because a large percentage believe it, therefore it's true.
Right.
And that
But
is,
at the same time, such arguments, though they are fallacious in their reasoning, they can point to the veracity of the statement. Like, for example, if right now we say the flat earth example, we say majority of the world, I don't know the estimate figure, but the majority of the world believes that the world is actually a sphere. And yes, the world is a sphere, but we cannot use just that argument to prove that the earth is a sphere.
right. So we could say that the majority of the people today believe that the earth is spherical. And I mean, that's a fact. That's fine. We could say that. There's no problem with saying that. But now, if I asked you, why do you believe the earth is spherical? And you told me because the majority of people do, then that would be an appeal to popularity. Because that's not really giving me a reason. You're just saying because everybody believes it, therefore I believe it. I mean, that might be the case. That might be the case, and then that's fine, but that's not a good argument. That's not really rational thinking. You could say, well, I believe it because I've seen photos. You could talk about NASA. You could talk about agency. You could talk about like the scientific experiments. I mean, you could go on and on and on about all the reasons, and then you could say, taking all these things together, that's why I believe the Earth is spherical, and then that's fine. But if you simply just point to a group, then that's problematic. And again, here's where we get into some more of the nuance. Because what about an issue like vaccination or climate change or any issue where the vast majority of of experts, and I'm just going to keep this to science, because science is something that's demonstrable, something that we could verify, as opposed to like expert opinion, like a legal scholar or something. So let's say that if 97% of all the climatologists around the world accept the conclusion that, yeah, climate change is a problem, and it's human made, clearly the majority of us average people who don't have PhDs in climatology, we can't look at the research, or we can't go out and conduct our own experiments to try to come to that conclusion. For a lot of issues, we have to look at experts and say, well, this research has been done, it has been peer reviewed, it has been discussed and debated for decades, and this is the conclusion they come to. So I believe it because this is the consensus they come to. Now, people will say, well, that's an appeal to popularity, but that's where it gets in. Well, I would disagree. I would say it's an appeal to science. You're appealing to something that's demonstrable, something that's tested. But you have people who say, well, that's appeal to popularity, but you're not really talking about something that's popular. You're talking about something that's a consensus, an academic consensus, a scientific consensus, something that was demonstrable, that was actually proved and debated, discussed, peer reviewed. So therefore, it's not unreasonable to come to conclusions based on the opinions of experts. Something that's a little bit less controversial, but very similar. Let's say that you were there was something wrong with you, and you didn't know what it was, and you went to several different medical experts, and let's say you saw four different the top brain surgeons, and they all said the same thing, that you have a tumor in your left frontal lobe that needs to be removed. Then and somebody asks you, well, why do you think you have a tumor? And you say, well, because four doctors told me that I had four brain surgeons told me I had a tumor. That is completely reasonable to come to that conclusion based on their expertise, because there's no way you could possibly know any better. So sometimes you have to defer to experts when you are incapable of getting the information, or don't have access to the kind of information that they have. So you could see how these fallacies could turn into debates in themselves, and they could become controversial, and people could argue back and forth whether something actually is a fallacy or whether something isn't a fallacy. So there's a lot of area for debate and discussion here.
So before we move on to our final fallacy, when you said about, when you look at scientists and their claims, or example, the four neurosurgeons or the brain surgeons, would that come under purview of appeal to authority fallacy?
It could. You could say that, like, well, my brain surgeon or my surgeon told me that I had a brain tumor. And somebody said, well, why do you believe that? And he said, well, because he's an authority on the issue. He's an expert, and I believe him. So you could see the problem here. Because if you don't believe your own doctors, then you're probably not going to live very long, or not you're not going to be very healthy. On the other hand, maybe just believing them isn't good enough, and that's not always the case. Maybe your doctor will actually show you the MRI and show you where the brain tumor is. So you're not only saying, well, because my brain surgeon told me that I had a tumor, but you said, well, because my brain surgeon told me I had a tumor, and he showed me the images, the digital imaging of my brain with the tumor. So that was evidence enough for me, and that's enough to actually come to the conclusion that I have a tumor.
Right. So, and also when I present evidence for the belief in God, when I refer to, for example, the statement of Isaac Newton in Principia Mathematica about his belief in God, I do not use that as an argument for God. It's not because Einstein believed, therefore God exists. But rather it would be, I would place it to my audience as Einstein makes a claim. Why does Einstein, someone who's an expert on science, make that claim? And at the same time, I would contrast with someone like Sean Carroll, one of the famous cosmologists of our time. When he makes the claim, when he makes the opposition that God does not exist, that's a point for us to inquire into it. Why do experts differ? Why does an expert believe so and so? it's a point where it's valuable in the sense that if I bring out a statistics and I say, well, it's coming from the federal government, that would make sense because they are the authority on the statistics, on the data. At the same time, I ought to look into the evidence presented and see if they are right in it, if Isaac Newton is right, or if Sean Carroll is right, or if the federal government is right in those data. Now, lastly, we're looking at the ad hominem attack, and we are about to move into the final lap of our podcast. Bo, can you quickly clear out what ad hominem attack fallacy is and why we should not engage in such a fallacy?
Ad hominem basically stands for attack to the man. You're attacking the person as opposed to the argument. So if somebody says, like, makes a really good argument for, and you're debating them, you might respond with something like, yeah, well, you're a loser, so therefore I'm right. Well, okay, yeah, you may get some applause from the audience, which again goes back to the fact that debates aren't about who's the most logical and rational and reasonable. A lot of times it's about who's the most entertaining, no matter how wrong they are. That's why scientific debate, rational discourse is so much different than public debate or popular debate, YouTube debates especially, which tend to be the worst unless they're done, they're handled very well with a moderator or something. But you could see the problem with ad hominem debates. If somebody has a really good argument and you can't really address the argument because you're like, damn, that's a good argument. What I'll do instead is I'll attack the person making the argument and try to destroy their credibility or try to make them look foolish. Therefore, people will be less likely to believe the argument. And again, unfortunately, that is the case. If you have somebody who, let's say you have somebody who's like a serial rapist, somebody that would be despised by the majority of people, and they make a really good argument, and then their opponent says, do you realize that this argument is being made by a serial rapist? And then all of a sudden, their argument loses credibility. Now, here's again one of the fine points. What is the argument about? If the argument has nothing to do with them being a serial rapist, let's say their argument is about whether
the Earth being a sphere.
Sure, yeah, the Earth being a sphere or not, right? That is completely independent of them being a serial rapist. So for anybody to look at that argument that they made with any less credibility, or then it's just that's irrational. It's fallacious of them to do that. However, let's say that this person is trying to make an argument that they should be able to be a teacher at a high school. And that's the argument that they're making. And it comes out that, look, this person is a serial rapist. Well, that has a lot to do with their argument, what they're trying to say, because their character is a big part of the argument. So it's intertwined with the argument being made. And there's different levels, there's different forms of ad hominems as well. Like one is the ad hominem circumstantial. One of the good examples of this is, let's say you're going out to buy a car, and the car salesperson, person selling you the car, tells you that, oh, this is a fantastic car, and it's really great, and it runs well with a little bit of gas. You don't need to use a lot of gas, and they just start telling you a lot of these features of the car. Then you could say, well, you have to say that because you're trying to sell me the car, so therefore it's not true. That's fallacious. It's fallacious in the fact that just because they have an interest in the argument or what they're saying being true, it doesn't mean that it's not true. What it does mean is that you need to be more skeptical. You have to apply an extra layer of skepticism when accepting their argument, because there's motivation behind it. They have motivation. So it's not like all of these fallacies, they're not just ridiculous and they don't just appear out of nowhere. They're deceptive, and that's why one of the keys are they're deceptive. So if somebody is making an ad hominem, or it sounds like an ad hominem, you really have to dig in and look at it and say, does what the person is saying about the other person making the argument, it is the attack on the person, right, relevant to the argument being made. Because if it is, it's not necessarily an ad hominem, or it's not a very clear ad hominem. So you have to learn from it. But that is, like you suggested, that is one of the most common fallacies out there.
Because the most reason the reason why I see that very common is because it suddenly touches on people's emotion. They get enraged by the argument, and they sort of try to tear down the opposition, not by going and constructing a straw man, but by directly attacking the person. Sometimes being xenophobic, or in other instances.
Yes.
Right now, before we wind up, in the initial part you mentioned about cognitive biases, and also in your website you talked about heuristics. Now, I've studied about heuristics at a very superficial level in my behavioral science class, but I didn't come to think about it until you showed in that small couple of sentences on your website. Do you mind understanding heuristics, cognitive biases, and how it's different from logical fallacies in about under maybe 2 to 3 minutes, as we are nearing the end of our podcast?
Sure. Well, heuristics are basically rules of thumb. They're just a way to that our brain makes these quick decisions to understand the world better without actually going into deep reasoning. We don't have the cognitive capacity to seriously consider and think about and reason everything that comes across our path. We just can't do it. We need to make what's called like this system 1 and system 2 type of thinking. We need to make these fast and quick type of decisions. Not only will this save our lives in some circumstances, but also it helps us to just essentially navigate through life. So when we're talking about heuristics, they're general rules of thumb that tend to be right most of the time, as opposed to something that when we really apply reasoning to it, like careful consideration, we could get to the truth close to 100% of the time. And we do this all the time. And stereotyping is a good example of this. Stereotyping tends to be like a bad word in normal discourse, but in psychology, it's not a bad word. It's exactly something that we do, all of us do all the time, and it's incredibly valuable for us to make the right decisions the vast majority of the time. The problem with stereotyping, when we look at a certain group, or we could look at somebody and based on some superficial characteristics, make some quick judgments about them. These are heuristics, and then act accordingly. Or just consider our circumstances, make some quick judgments about people based on the circumstances, and act accordingly. A lot of times that will put us in the right more times than not. So, for example, if let's say that a bunch of people just broke out of prison, and you're in a dark alley, you're walking home in the city, and you're passing them, and you know that these guys, because they all have the jumpsuits on from prison. Now these could be the nicest guys in the world. They could be fantastic. They could have got caught for for something silly. They could have been falsely accused, or maybe they're white collar criminals and they wouldn't hurt a fly. But it is in your best interest to turn around the other way and run instead of facing these people. And that's a heuristic. That's a judgment we're making. We're making a stereotype. More times than not, we're going to be right and make the right decision, but not all the time. And a lot of our decision process comes from these type of heuristics and these type of stereotypes. And it doesn't mean that we're being irrational. It just means that we're not applying careful enough skepticism or enough rationality to whatever decision if we are using heuristics.
Wow.
Now, cognitive biases, that's the other part of it. Cognitive biases are, let's say, the foundation of a lot of logical fallacies. They're ways of thinking that are sort of like optical illusions. You know how we have optical illusions and it tricks our brain? Cognitive biases are like illusions, but in the way we think. And it makes sense to us However, when we really think about it, or if we know how our mind works, we realize that biases are really errors in the way that we're thinking. So, for example, one of the most common biases is called the confirmation bias. Basically, this is when we already have we've already come to a conclusion, whether it be for total emotional reasons. Maybe we were brought up, we were raised believing something, and then all the information that comes to us via the confirmation bias, we tend to ignore the information that contradicts our belief, and we just focus on the information that supports our belief. Likewise, we can use this proactively, this confirmation bias. So, for example, in the politics here in the U.S. is crazy. It's very divided between Republicans and Democrats, or liberals and conservatives, and we have different sources of media that we can consume to get our news. And the liberals tend to choose very liberal sources, and they get all their information from liberal sources, whereas conservatives will choose very conservative sources of media, and they get very different news and a different spin, sometimes even different facts, which is crazy and shouldn't happen, but it does happen. And what we don't tend to do is we don't tend to say, okay, let me get my source from a very neutral source, because that doesn't tend to be as sexy or as interesting or as entertaining. Or we don't say, let me make sure all of my news sources are mixed with a variety of very liberal sources and conservative sources, so I could get a better picture of what's going on. And when there is a conflict or contradiction, I could use my system 2 thinking, my processing, my rationality, my reasoning, and really find out what's going on and come to the truth. That is really good critical thinking, but unfortunately, that's not what people do. Via this confirmation bias, we just stick with things that stick with information that's less upsetting to us, that's more likely to allow us to keep our current beliefs. And if we look at the logical fallacies, like the whole list of them, we'll see that there is some kind of cognitive bias behind the vast majority of logical fallacies.
Right. Wow, that was absolutely phenomenal. Even though I've been familiar with so many logical fallacies in my own study, these five to six fallacies, as you have explained with all the nuances, have actually brought great insight to me. And I'll be dropping the link to Bo's online course in the description. And if our audience wants to try out the course a bit and see how it suits you, if you want to try your hand at it, there are sample classes available, and it's quite cheap for anyone who wants to get into a great insight into logical fallacy, on how to identify them, how to identify these minute nuances, and be very effective in your arguments, in your reasoning, in your own critical thinking. As we had addressed earlier about epistemic responsibility, your own responsibility to know the truth and to understand that to your best of your abilities. One another person that I recall right at the top of my mind, who has been quite famous for presenting, for educating his audience on logical fallacies and putting out resources out there, is the famous YouTube atheist who runs the channel Rationality Rules, Steven. Steven also has some resources on this topic, and this is now right coming off the top of my mind. And once I get hold of those on his site, I'll be dropping the link to the description as well. And if our audience hasn't recognized yet, so far we've had some of the top Christian apologists and philosophers and authors on our podcast. Bo is actually a non-theist on our podcast, and I'm very delighted to have this great conversation with Bo. So if I were to commit a logical fallacy, I should have said that Bo is a non-theist, so Bo can't make any valuable claims of reality. But that would be a logical fallacy, and that would be an attack on Bo's credentials as well. I'm really delighted to have this conversation, Bo, and thank you so much for bringing such valuable insight to our audience. And I highly recommend our audience to go check out his website. There is an active open forum for you to post your questions on logical fallacies, and there's a team standby to respond. Get hold of his book if you can. Get hold of as many books as you can on us, as you have right now encountered this delightful conversation, this enlightening conversation with Bo Bennett. Thank you so much, Bo, for coming on our podcast. We're absolutely thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Jacob. It was a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
All right, looking forward to having you more often, Bo, and thank you so much to our audience for tuning in. We'll see you in the next one.
fire. My soul dancing like